First I want to say, I'm the one that said that I'm 3 for 3. I didn't make it clear that that's in Guantánamo terms. And all I meant was there's been some good news yesterday. I represented 3 detainees. 2 of them were as detailed defense counsel, another one's just a support counsel helping develop arguments. But anyway, one, policy, and let me also make clear I'm only speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for any of the former prisoners, current prisoners, or any of the teams. I'm retired, but still from the Army, sort of partial retirement anyway, but never really careers. But anyway, I'm, like I say, not speaking for anybody. I'm still a defense counsel on the parole team. We don't know where that's going to be, but yesterday the government recommended to the D.C. Circuit, I don't want to misrepresent how they put it, but that these charges be reversed because he's convicted under because of the Honda decision earlier in October. Anyway, so, but I have been part of one team where the detainee did go back to his country, and that was Ibrahim Kosi. He was convicted of material support for terrorism and conspiracy. He won't go into all the details, but he went back to Sudan 2 years, last July, after serving 2 years, in addition to the 10 years or so before that. So, and then the other one is the one case that was the government responded to yesterday, Ali al-Balul. It's an appellate case. He's been there from the very beginning. The government said from the very beginning he's guilty of war crimes called material support for terrorism, conspiracy, solicitation. The government is now saying, sort of, oops, maybe they're not war crimes after all. But parts of the government are still insisting that they are, so that story isn't over with. And the third one is Mustafa al-Hassawi, who supposedly the chief prosecutor is now recommending to the judge down there that at least the conspiracy charge be dismissed. He still has a number of other charges. But that's why I say 3 for 3, part of that, getting the conspiracy charge out of the way. Anyway, with that, let me then immediately say that I've been here since 2008, and every year on the anniversary of Guantánamo and other times, this group here, all of you, every single one individually, has been very active, and you're all heroes in my eyes. So you've been out there keeping this matter, this issue in the public view. So again, don't ever think that you people, each of you are not heroes. You've done, if the defense counsel's office is full of people like you, I'm sure Guantánamo would have been shut down a long time ago because we need as much passion as possible. And finally, let me say, Andy Worthington, and even more, our defense office is filled with Andy Worthingtons, the commissions in Guantánamo would have been shut down a long time ago. He's done so much, and quite honestly, I only wish that everybody representing detainees did as much as Andy Worthington has done, so he can't be thanked enough. But having said that, let me say a couple things. A couple of years ago, I was at a conference that Andy was speaking at. I never like to miss an opportunity to hear him speak. And going on a while, and about the third time somebody asked a question saying, starting off by saying, well, at least we don't torture anymore. So this was in, 2010, 2011. And somebody said, well, at least we don't torture anymore. By the third time, sort of a light went on in my head. What do you mean we don't torture anymore? We got people now being held in indefinite detention. And, I've been on one military deployment where I thought, is this ever going to end? And it was torturous in a sense. And I knew it was going to end. But these people know that it's not going to end. And I know the effect it had on me, just wondering, when do I ever get out of here? And so you can imagine, I could imagine how harmful this is mentally. And I think with the Latif is a perfect example. At some point, you just give up. Mentally, spiritually, why would you go on? You're not getting out of it. Fortunately, because unfortunately it doesn't get much attention, but fortuitously I made a couple of inquiries and a study was being done by the Physicians for Human Rights, where they made exactly that argument. Indefinite detention can rise to torture. So we should not deceive ourselves by telling us that we're no longer torturing. We've actually created a more sophisticated form and level of torture, I would say, with this indefinite detention, like Andy has talked about already. But then I want to say, a year ago, I wrote an article, Guantánamo at 10, was what it was entitled. But it was, so on the Todd case I've been on, I've had to do a lot of research. And one thing's led to another. And so we had to do a lot of research in the Civil War cases and in Kieran, which is where the government originally got the idea of the unlawful combatant status and whatnot. And so I had to really dig into this. And in the course of doing it, I've also got a lot of commentators. And a couple of years ago, I read one book, Law in Times of Crisis, where some law professor was saying, you know, during this period of crisis, you know, who do we turn to for wisdom on this? Who do we go to for a source of how do we handle this? Carl Schmitt, he said. And that was a focus of my article. Carl Schmitt was this Nazi legal jurist. Before he'd become a Nazi, he was just plain a militarist, a German militarist following World War I, who was a very active advocate of dictatorship and wars. He was a pure militarist. And then all of a sudden, here in the 21st century, American lawyers are saying, we need to look at Carl Schmitt for what to do in this emergency. And I mean, again, the emergency is what? We got a couple terrorist attacks, but other countries have had those too, without exaggerating them into an existential threat. So on this pretext that we're in this threat, constant emergency, we've got people now saying, we've got to go back to the Nazis and see how they handled things. And to me, that was outrageous. I made the point that my dad had been in the Bataan Death March, sort of the, Asian version of that same militarism. And to me, again, I say it was outrageous that we're sitting here talking about going to the Nazis now to figure out what to do. Well then, so doing more research, I came across a couple of others, and I mentioned them in this article. Adrian Vermeil, who teaches at Harvard Law School, you know, the elite law school of the land. Eric Posner, who teaches at University of Chicago, another very elite law school. And, they've written books based on, we need to go back and we've got to look at Carl Schmitt. And, just one thing leads to another. This is really the source of what we're confronted with here, this genuine militarism and authoritarianism within what has to be described as a hardcore right wing that has seen this as an opportunity, and they make no secret of it. Posner and Vermeil, they talk about, in this war, and people like Ben Wittes, these public figures, you can read their books or writings, they say, well, we have to might have to go to censorship, we can't be having the morale of our soldiers maybe diminished because of negative things being said or whatever. And this is right out of, totalitarian states. Then about the same time, and I mentioned this because this was new at the time, and I hope you don't mind, I'm not talking exactly about Guantánamo, but this is simply an outgrowth of the whole Guantánamo and the military commissions. Last year, at the end of the year, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed with what's Section 1021, where it provided that for anybody suspected of having an association with Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or associated forces, whatever that means, the military was mandated to detain them under military detention and for disposition under the law of war. So having had to do all this research I've done on the law of war in the Civil War cases, I immediately knew what that meant. The law of war is really, as so many commentators and Supreme Court justices have said, the abolition of law. It's that period of time when there may be, and it's supposed to only be a genuine emergency, when there is actually where a breakdown of civil government, so okay, for temporarily you might have the military exercising martial law, and that's synonymous with law of war. And so for a very short period of time, you might have a prerogative of the government where they don't have to recognize the Constitution. And we saw this in the Civil War, and we saw that a little bit in World War II, removing the Japanese Americans from the West Coast. That was a matter that began with the general out on the West Coast saying, I just don't trust these Japanese Americans, I want them out of here. And it was later ratified by Congress, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the commander-in-chief, not as a president, but as a commander-in-chief, and so they were removed. Those cases were never overturned, and the reason they weren't, because the Supreme Court said, well, we have to defer to the military when there's a military necessity. So that understanding of the law of war still stands. And so now, but we've always understood, okay, under the Civil War, we really did have tyranny on both sides. I mean, the Confederacy was doing this too. Military tribunals for people who they saw as disloyal, or guerrillas, fighting, within. But the overlying theory of the whole thing was that anybody acting disloyally in the country was actually a hostile, and therefore were subject to military commission. And so we had a lot of military commissions in the government. Like Brigadier General Mark Martins, he likes to brag that we have this rich tradition of military commissions going back to Major Andre, who was spying for the British. And yeah, we did have a military commission for him. A spy is subject to a military commission. But it wasn't a system of military commissions, and it wasn't something where we didn't have the judiciary yet. But a spy is subject to military commission, but it's an extraordinary situation. That was one case out of the Revolutionary War. It doesn't create a tradition. Then we did have a very offensive situation with Andrew Jackson, and that came up in the case I'm on, where he summarily executed some Seminole Indian chiefs, but he did go through the motions of having a military commission for 2 British merchants before executing them. Then next we had some of the Mexican Mexican-American War, because we were another country and they were sort of a military government. But the Civil War is what the government loves to claim as our military commission tradition, and something that we should be proud of. And in fact, it was a very despotic rule. But you could at least argue, and I'm not, but there was a military necessity for it. So obviously, we were in a tremendous Civil War, and hundreds of thousands died. I know the number, but anyway, so and they became ever more draconian as long as the war went on. That's not a proud part of our tradition, though. And it wasn't a proud part of that tradition at that time. At the end of the war, the Milligan case basically held, and it didn't settle this entirely, I won't go into details, but it was very repulsive to the judiciary, and they said, no, okay, unless there's an act of invasion, you can't have martial law. Okay, it's a little bit more nuanced, but we didn't do that again until World War II, until Kieran came up, and we had to keep a secret from the Germans how easy it had been to get through our lines. And that's all that was decided. They'd come through our lines, and that was basically falling under this disloyalty condition. They were, the Supreme Court didn't say they're guilty of conspiracy, they're not guilty of aiding and abetting. They're just guilty of, because they were within our lines as enemy soldiers without distinction. That was the offense that was upheld. The government has taken that, and in that case, it used the term unlawful combatant. So the government took that term at the very beginning, grabbed it out of context, and said anybody who doesn't have a uniform on is an unlawful combatant. And that's why they said, all these people that we just picked up, they don't have the type of uniforms that we do. I mean, they obviously could tell each other apart, between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, because, and then the Northern Alliance, because they wouldn't want to shoot each other in themselves. So they fought under symbols, so we knew who they were fighting and who was their friends. But we distorted that and said, well, they don't have uniforms on, therefore they're war criminals. And we started this whole process, and again, we took that phrase, unlawful combatant, out of context with Kieran, because Kieran only held that these people had come, the 8 German senators had come through our lines, into our territory. That did not apply to people picked up in Afghanistan, entirely outside our territory, on the other side of the world, who wasn't even fighting us when we ran into Afghanistan. They were fighting the Taliban, and they were fighting the Northern Alliance, and we used to support the Taliban, when they're called something different, when we were fighting the Soviets. So we just took all these things out of context. We said people who, somebody who doesn't have a uniform on, they're an unlawful combatant, overlooking the rich tradition that we have supporting unlawful combatants in the government's term, such as World War II, when we sent in OSS agents and supported the guerrillas and whatnot against the Germans. But we've just been using these different things to misrepresent history and to create this belief that everybody there, such as the cook, Ibrahim El-Kosi, is this terrorist, the worst of the worst. Okay, so my point is here, though, is with the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, we've now brought that body of law, this nullification law, law of war, into our own federal statute. we're now saying that somebody who gives any assistance to an associated force, or whatever that is, and that would have to include material support for terrorism, which we know people, anti-war activists out in the Midwest have been investigated for material support for terrorism. We're saying those people who are giving any support to our enemies are subject to military detention. And then, you know, so some journalists, Chris Hedges and some others, brought a lawsuit for injunctive relief to enjoin the enforcement of that, saying, you know, hey, we could be subject to this. And the government said, basically, you know, nothing to see here, move along. You know, of course, we would never detain journalists, you know, and deny this, and, you know, but they would never say we would not charge you. But they qualified very carefully. Well, based upon this, we wouldn't detain them, leaving it wide open that, well, with a slight divergence, well, of course we will. But at the same time, speaking out that side of their mouth, the other side of their mouth is over in the military commissions, and they're saying, well, yeah, we have this rich tradition of military commissions and military detention, and here's the cases that we were proud of. We held this and had a military commission for this guerrilla and this bridge burner and this newspaper publisher. And then some other guerrillas and on and on. Well, again, buried in those claims of precedent is a newspaper publisher. And in fact, we began looking at the many military commissions that were held. The most prominent is Clement Vallandigham, who was up in Ohio, far away from any battlefield, saying, you know, I think this war is wrong. Well, he got General Burnside said, you know, hey, you know, you're interfering with my military options. You know, detained him, had a military commission, sentenced him to imprisonment. Didn't look good for Lincoln, so he said, well, send him over to the Confederacy, even though he wasn't a Confederate. And that happened repeatedly, and many more. But most of them get sent out of the country, you know, get sent out of the North because, but, you know, we're just playing in prison. And there's documents, documenting evidences. So again, to me, it's what we're seeing with the military commissions now, and it's happened elsewhere. You know, when France had their the war against the Algerian insurgents, because, you know, anti-colonial insurgents, they said, don't worry, we're adopting a lot of draconian legal tactics and whatnot, principles, but don't worry, you'll never touch, you know, Frenchmen back in France. And sure enough, they did. These various principles did come back and, you know, and reached into the French law. We're seeing the same thing now. 10 years ago, we said, yeah, don't worry, this is, you know, we'll take care of these terrorists and you know, using these commissions, and, you know, we got, you know, and then later when it got challenged, like Andy pointed out, and had made some changes because of the lawsuit, or rather the court cases, ending up with what Mark Lawrence calls the reformed 2009 Military Commissions Act, which still provides that material support for terrorism and all these other things, you know, really, it's not reform at all, it's, you know, put a little bit more lipstick on it. But, you know, we're saying, you know, this is all crept back in with Section 1021 because, as I pointed out in that article a year ago, the law of war is basically the foundation, not basically, it is the foundation for totalitarian legal systems. Solzhenitsyn wasn't tried by a civil court in Russia. He was tried by the military collegium in the Soviet Union when he got sent to the Gulag. It was a military tribunal that sentenced Solzhenitsyn, and his offense was disloyalty, just like we did in the Civil War. The Germans, they wanted, you know, they felt they'd been stabbed in the back in World War I, so they weren't going to allow that to happen again. Anybody who was going to be dissenting was going to be treated as a traitor. They set up the People's Court for war treason, which is a term we used in the Civil War cases. Anybody who had showed any disloyalty or wasn't sufficiently loyal was guilty of war treason. That was the military commissions we had in the Civil War. That's our heritage, and that was a heritage, and that was what the People's Court in Nazi Germany was set up. And if somebody said, I think Hitler shouldn't have brought this war on, they got put in front of the People's Court, which was the equivalent to a military commission, and sentenced frequently to execution. They went out to, although they were Germany, they went out and said, so some French person was hostile to the hostile Germany before the war, and with a nice fog decree, they picked up people in these countries that they invaded and charged them with offenses for what they had done before the war. Just like we went and said, somebody over in Afghanistan, you know, committed an offense sometime, you know,
We've had government officials say, well, let's count the war going back to 1998. Well, why not 1996? And saying that these people have committed war crimes. You look at it, I'm not saying the United States is the Soviet Union or the Nazis, I'm just saying the legal framework, the form of the legal framework is there. And we're now at the sufferance of somebody, the commander-in-chief or whoever, whether or not people who are dissenting from government policies or journalists, could they be arrested? Well, under the precedents that the government is very proudly proclaiming, the answer would have to be yes. Anyway, that was my point. This has contaminated, this has come back and is infecting our own legal system now. The cost of it is not just the hostility we've created in the world for seeing this double standard and how we have created, the rule of law for everyone else, but not for us. But now it's even coming back and potentially could reach American citizens too. And that's simply an objective analysis of Section 1021 and going by statements that Senators Graham, McCain, Ayotte, Lieberman have all said on the Senate floor that this is a battlefield. And nobody has ever said that a battlefield has constitutional rights. So if these people, these senators are saying this here is a battlefield, they're saying, and we don't recognize constitutional rights on it. That is what in fact is being said. Anyway, with that I'll stop. Thank you very much again.